Some ideas shake the world not by being loud, but by being quietly impossible. Russell's paradox, logic, language, and the limits of thought, is one of those ideas. It's a simple question that broke the confidence of an entire generation of thinkers. And it didn't come from politics or religion, it came from logic itself. At the start of the 20th century, logic was on a mission. Great thinkers like Gottlob Frege believed that all of mathematics could be built from logic alone. The idea was bold, that with just a few symbols and rules, we could explain numbers, proofs, and even the universe itself. This dream was called logicism. It promised clarity, certainty, and truth, free from the messiness of human opinion. But then came Bertrand Russell. In 1902, Russell wrote a letter to Frege. In it, he shared a problem. A small question, really, but one that unraveled the whole system. He asked, what if we imagine a set that includes all sets that do not include themselves? That's it. Just that. But here's the twist. If that set contains itself, then by definition it shouldn't. But if it doesn't contain itself, then it should. It's a perfect loop, a logical trap. The system breaks. Frege was stunned. His life's work was at risk. Logic, which was supposed to be the firm foundation beneath math and science, had shown a crack. This wasn't just a problem in math. It was a challenge to how we think. If our most precise tools, logic and language, can create contradictions, what can we really trust? What are the limits of human thought? Russell's paradox is more than a technical glitch. It's a moment of deep philosophical importance. It reminds us that even in our most careful reasoning, paradox can sneak in. It shows how our minds, in trying to explain everything, can tie themselves in knots. In this video, we'll walk through the story of Russell's paradox. We'll look at the dreams of logicism, the moment the paradox was discovered, and what it means for philosophy, language, and even computer science today. We'll also explore the many attempts to solve it, and why some say it can never truly be fixed. This isn't just about sets or symbols, it's about something deeper, how we search for truth, and what happens when that search points back at us. To understand why Russell's paradox mattered so much, we need to go back to a time when logic wasn't just a tool, it was seen as the ultimate answer. In the late 1800s, many philosophers and mathematicians believed they were on the verge of building a perfect system of thought, a system where all truths, especially mathematical ones, could be proven step by step using pure logic. This idea didn't come out of nowhere. It was shaped by two major forces: the rise of formal logic and the birth of set theory. A. Frege's big dream. Logicism. One of the most important figures in this story is Gottlob Frege. He was a German philosopher and mathematician who believed that all of arithmetic, things like numbers, addition, and equations, could be reduced to logic. He called this project logicism. Frege didn't just talk about this idea, he built it. In the 1870s and 1880s, he created a new kind of symbolic language that could express logical relationships more clearly than ever before. His major works, Begriffsschrift, which means concept script, and Grundgesetze der Arithmetik, basic laws of arithmetic, were some of the first serious attempts to build mathematics from logic alone. To Frege, numbers weren't just marks on a page, they were logical objects. He wanted to define them in a precise, step-by-step way, using nothing but clear reasoning. And for a while, it looked like he was succeeding. B. Cantor and the birth of set theory. At the same time, Frege was developing logicism. Another revolution was happening, set theory, created by Georg Cantor. Cantor's idea was simple but powerful. A set is just a collection of things. Those things could be numbers, shapes, people, anything. For example, the set of even numbers or the set of planets in our solar system. But Cantor didn't stop with simple examples. He went deep. He used sets to explore infinity and discovered that some infinities are bigger than others. This was radical, and it changed mathematics forever. Set theory quickly became a foundation for all of math. If you could define numbers and operations in terms of sets, and define sets using logic, then everything could be reduced to a single unified system. It was a beautiful vision. But there was a problem. No one had carefully defined what a set actually was. The idea seemed so basic, so obvious, that people didn't question it. You could collect things together. What more was there to say? That assumption would soon be exposed as dangerous. Chapter C, the 19th century mindset, the age of foundations. Frege and Cantor weren't working in isolation. Their goals were part of a bigger movement in the 19th century, a time when thinkers wanted to place all knowledge on solid ground. Mathematicians had started to feel uneasy. Earlier in the century, calculus and geometry were based on intuition and hand-waving arguments. But by the late 1800s, people wanted rigor. Every step had to be justified. No gaps, no fuzzy logic. This drive for certainty also came from philosophy. Thinkers like Immanuel Kant had tried to show how knowledge was possible. But Frege and others believed we could go even further. We could build truth from the ground up, starting with logic. So they began writing new systems, using symbols instead of words. They wanted to remove all ambiguity. They believed that with the right rules, you could build an entire universe of knowledge that never contradicted itself. This wasn't just a technical project. It was almost a spiritual one. They were chasing perfect understanding. And that's what makes Russell's paradox so powerful. It didn't just poke a hole in one part of this system. It showed that the very foundation, set theory and logic itself, might be flawed. When Russell sent his famous letter to Frege in 1902, it hit like an earthquake. Frege was about to publish the second volume of his great work. But Russell's paradox showed that one of Frege's key rules led directly to contradiction. In a note added to the book, Frege wrote, "Hardly anything more undesirable can happen to a scientific writer than to have one of the foundations of his edifice shaken after the work is finished." That moment marked the end of the dream of a perfect logical system, at least in its original form. By now we've seen how logic and set theory were supposed to build the foundation for all of mathematics. But what exactly did Bertrand Russell discover that caused everything to shake? Let's walk through the paradox itself, what it says, how it works, and why it was such a big deal. A. The setup. A strange kind of set. In ordinary life, we group things together all the time. A basket of apples, a list of names, a set of even numbers. No problem. But what if we start thinking about sets in a more abstract way? Let's say we define a set as any collection of things that follow a rule. For example, the set of all cats, the set of all numbers greater than 5, the set of all sets that contain exactly 3 elements. And then we get to this strange one, the set of all sets that do not contain themselves. It sounds odd, but stick with it. Normally, sets don't contain themselves. The set of cats isn't a cat. The set of numbers greater than 5 isn't a number. So, a set that doesn't contain itself. That makes sense, but here's the trick. What happens if we ask, B, is this set a member of itself? Let's call this strange set R, where RR are the set of all sets that do not contain themselves. Now the question is, does R contain itself? Let's think it through. Option 1, suppose R does contain itself, but R is only supposed to contain sets that don't contain themselves. So if R contains itself, it shouldn't. Option 2, suppose R doesn't contain itself. But then it fits the rule. It's a set that doesn't contain itself, which means it should contain itself. Both answers cancel themselves out. Whether you say yes or no, you run into contradiction. That's the heart of Russell's paradox. C. Why it's so dangerous now? You might be thinking, okay, that's weird, but why does it matter? It matters because the whole system of set theory at the time was built on the idea that any rule could define a set. This was called the unrestricted comprehension principle. If you could describe it, you could make a set out of it. Russell showed that this idea leads straight into contradiction. And in logic, one contradiction is all it takes to bring the house down. If your system allows even one paradox, then you can prove anything, true or false. That's because, in formal logic, once a contradiction exists, you can twist it into any conclusion. So when Russell found this paradox, he wasn't just pointing out a quirky brain teaser. He was saying, the very rules we're using to build mathematics contain a fatal flaw. It would be like discovering that the foundation of a skyscraper is cracked. Everything above it suddenly looks unstable. D. Frege's reaction. A dream collapsing. When Russell wrote to Frege about this, Frege had just finished writing his great work on logic and arithmetic. The second volume of Grundgesetze was about to be published. Russell's letter arrived just in time to include a heartbroken note at the end of the book. In it, Frege wrote, "Your discovery of the contradiction has shaken the ground under me." He realized that the very foundations of his system had been undermined. His beautiful project, decades in the making, was suddenly in danger of falling apart. E. What makes this paradox unique? There are other paradoxes in philosophy, like the liar paradox. This sentence is false. That's also a loop. If the sentence is true, then it must be false. If it's false, then it must be true. But Russell's paradox is different because it wasn't just a puzzle of language, it was embedded inside a formal mathematical system. It was written in the language of logic itself, and that meant it couldn't be ignored. This wasn't about poetry or clever wordplay, it was about truth, proof, and the core of how we think. Russell's paradox isn't just a quirky problem in set theory, it's something much deeper. It's a moment where logic, the very thing we turn to for clarity, suddenly turns on itself, and that moment forces us to ask bigger questions. Not just about math or sets, but about how we think, how we use language, and whether we can ever build a system that explains everything without falling apart. At the core of the paradox is the idea of self-reference, something referring to itself. This might seem harmless, but it's a tricky concept. You've probably heard the famous liar paradox before. This sentence is false. If it's true, then it's false. If it's false, then it's true. It creates a loop that logic can't break. Russell's paradox works the same way, but in the strict world of mathematics. It asks if a set can contain itself. And the answer leads to contradiction either way. That's what makes it so powerful. It shows that even in a system built to be exact, precise, and foolproof, contradiction can still sneak in. This shook the foundations of logicism, the idea that all of mathematics could be reduced to logic. For thinkers like Frege and even Russell himself, this was a serious blow. They believed that math could be built from just a few basic logical truths. But the paradox showed that their foundation wasn't solid. If set theory, which was supposed to be the groundwork of all math, could lead to contradiction, then the whole structure was at risk. But the impact went beyond math. It opened up a new set of questions about language and meaning. In everyday language, we say things like, the set of all sets that don't include themselves, and it feels clear. But in logic, you can't get away with loose phrasing. Every term must be defined precisely. The paradox revealed how easily we can be fooled by our own words. Something can sound meaningful, yet fall apart the moment we try to make it fully logical. This idea would later inspire philosophers like Ludwig Wittgenstein. He began to see that many philosophical problems are actually problems of language. We get confused, not because reality is confusing, but because we try to say things that don't really make sense. The paradox is a perfect example of this. It's not just about logic, it's about how we think, and how we sometimes reach too far with the tools we have. Even more than that, Russell's paradox made people question whether we can ever build a complete and perfect system. Philosophers had long dreamed of a single framework that explained everything, one ultimate system of truth. But the paradox shows what happens when a system tries to describe itself. It breaks. It collapses under its own weight. This idea that no system can fully contain itself would later return in an even stronger form through the work of Kurt Gödel. Gödel proved that in any system complex enough to include basic math, there will always be truths that the system can't prove. In other words, some things are true, but the system can't explain why. That's a hard pill to swallow for anyone chasing total certainty. And yet, this isn't just an issue for philosophers or logicians. The same pattern shows up in the real world. In computer science, self-reference can lead to infinite loops, crashes, or bugs that are hard to fix. In artificial intelligence, people ask whether machines can truly understand themselves, or whether they'll run into the same problems that logic did. Even in law or government, we see the problem. Systems that try to oversee themselves often run into paradoxes, rules about rules, judges judging judges. In every one of these cases, the same question comes back. Can a system ever fully include itself? Or is there always a point where it breaks? That's why Russell's paradox still matters. It's more than just a math problem. It's a lesson about the limits of reason, the dangers of overconfidence, and the strange way that truth sometimes slips through our fingers when we try to grasp it too tightly. But maybe that's not a failure. Maybe it's a kind of wisdom. Russell's paradox doesn't just tell us something about logic. It tells us something about ourselves. That our minds are powerful, yes, but also vulnerable to confusion. That the more we try to explain, the more we risk creating puzzles we can't solve. And maybe that's okay. Because in the end, the paradox is a mirror. It reflects back the human desire to know everything, and the humbling truth that some things might always lie just beyond reach. Coming up next, we'll look at how Russell tried to fix the very problem he discovered. He didn't just walk away from the paradox. He built a whole new system to try and stop it from happening again. It's time to explore Russell's bold solution, the theory of types. After discovering the paradox that carried his name, Bertrand Russell didn't stop. He didn't walk away from the problem, he faced it head-on. If logic had a crack in its foundation, then the question was, how do we fix it? His answer was something bold, something technical, and something that changed the course of logic forever. It was called the theory of types. The idea behind the theory of types is simple on the surface. The paradox happens because sets are allowed to get too close to themselves. They're allowed to refer to themselves in ways that create confusion. So Russell's solution was to block that from happening by creating a hierarchy, a structure where each thing belongs to a certain type and can only refer to types below it, never to itself or anything on the same level. Imagine it like this. Picture a staircase. At the bottom are basic objects, individual things like numbers or people. One step up, you have sets of those things. Another step up, you have sets of sets, and so on. What Russell said was, you can only build sets from the level below you. You can't build a set that tries to include itself because it's not on a lower step, it's on the same one. So in this system, the problematic idea, the set of all sets that do not contain themselves, simply can't exist. It's not allowed. It breaks the rules of the hierarchy. And because it's blocked before it even gets started, the paradox is avoided. This approach became the basis for what Russell and Alfred North Whitehead built in their massive work, Principia Mathematica. It was published in 3 volumes, starting in 1910, and it was one of the most ambitious attempts ever made to rebuild all of mathematics from logic, this time without the cracks. To be clear, Principia Mathematica is not light reading. It's filled with dense symbols, layers of definitions, and long pages where even simple truths take dozens of steps to prove. Famously, it takes several hundred pages just to prove that 1 + 1 = 2, but Russell and Whitehead weren't trying to be elegant, they were trying to be safe. They wanted a system that would never again allow something like the paradox to slip through. And for a while it worked. The theory of types became one of the standard ways of handling paradoxes in logic. It was adopted, refined, and built upon by many others. In computer science, similar ideas still show up today, especially in programming languages that use types to prevent certain kinds of errors. But the system wasn't perfect. One major criticism was that the hierarchy Russell introduced felt a little artificial. It was a fix, but not a very natural one. The levels of types weren't always easy to define, and the rules could become confusing. In some cases, you had to guess what type something was, and if you got it wrong, the whole argument could fall apart. To deal with these issues, Russell added even more complexity. He introduced something called the ramified theory of types, which added layers within layers. It wasn't just about types, it was also about orders within those types. This was meant to solve a further problem called the vicious circle, where something can't be defined in terms of itself. But as you can imagine, the system started to become very hard to manage. It was like building extra floors on a house to keep out a mouse. The mouse might be gone, but now the house is impossible to live in. That's why, over time, other thinkers began looking for different solutions. Some turned to new versions of set theory, like the Zermelo-Fraenkel system, which avoided the paradox by restricting how sets could be formed. Others looked to entirely different foundations, like category theory, or even questioned whether we needed foundations at all. Still, Russell's theory of types was a turning point. It was the first serious attempt to fix logic by rebuilding its structure, and it showed how seriously philosophers and mathematicians were willing to take the problem. They weren't just patching a hole, they were rethinking what logic could and couldn't do. Even today, the spirit of Russell's idea is still alive. In computer science, type systems are used to prevent errors by making sure variables and functions don't interact in forbidden ways. In philosophy, the paradox continues to inspire discussions about truth, self-reference, and the limits of expression. So while the theory of types may not have been the final answer, it was a major step forward. It showed that we can confront deep contradictions, not by ignoring them, but by changing the rules that allowed them in the first place. And perhaps more importantly, it showed that even the sharpest minds can get tangled in their own tools. Russell's paradox wasn't a mistake, it was a discovery, a warning. And the theory of types was the first attempt to answer that warning with a system that could hold its own weight. Up next, we'll explore what came after Russell's fix. Because while the theory of types solved one problem, it opened the door to many more. Other thinkers came in with new ideas, new frameworks, and new ways of building logic from the ground up. Let's take a closer look at the alternatives to Russell's solution, and how the search for safe foundations continued long after the paradox was first revealed. Russell's theory of types was a bold attempt to stop the paradox he had discovered, but it wasn't the only path forward. In fact, over the years, many thinkers came up with different ways to solve, or at least contain, the problem. Some of these solutions simplified the foundations of logic. Others redefined what a set even is. And some decided to rethink the rules of logic itself. Let's walk through the most important responses that came after Russell, and how each of them tried to avoid the trap of self-reference. The first major alternative came from a mathematician named Ernst Zermelo. In 1908, just a few years after Russell's paradox was published, Zermelo proposed a new system for set theory. His idea was simple but powerful. Instead of letting any description define a set, like in Frege's system, he said we should be more careful. We should only allow sets to be built from sets that already exist. This became the core idea behind what we now call Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory, or ZF. And when combined with the axiom of choice, it's known as ZFC. These systems work by replacing the old, unrestricted comprehension rule with something safer. You can still build sets, but only in limited, well-defined ways. For example, you can form a subset from an existing set, but you can't create the set of all sets out of thin air. That kind of global definition is blocked. ZFC also adds something called the axiom of regularity, which says no set can contain itself, directly or indirectly. This rule shuts down the exact kind of self-reference that caused Russell's paradox. It doesn't try to fix the contradiction, it just makes sure you can't ever write it down in the first place. For most working mathematicians today, ZFC is the standard foundation. It's practical, powerful, and free of known paradoxes. But some people see it as a bit of a patch job. It avoids trouble, yes, but it does so by limiting what we're allowed to say. It doesn't solve the mystery of the paradox. It just keeps the door locked. Another response came from Willard van Orman Quine, a philosopher and logician who didn't like the complexity of Russell's hierarchy. In the 1930s, Quine proposed a simpler alternative called New Foundations, or NF for short. His system also used types, but in a much more flexible way. Instead of building a tall staircase of types like Russell did, Quine allowed sets to be members of themselves under certain rules, as long as those rules stayed consistent. In other words, he didn't ban self-reference outright. He just made sure it couldn't lead to contradiction. New Foundations is clever, and it avoids Russell's paradox, but it never caught on widely. Some aspects of it remain unclear, and while it's logically consistent as far as we know, it doesn't support all the tools that modern mathematicians want to use. As people searched for cleaner answers, some thinkers went even further. They started asking a new question. What if the problem isn't with set theory at all? What if the problem is with logic itself? This opened the door to non-classical logics, systems where the usual rules of truth and falsehood are changed. For example, in para-consistent logic, contradictions aren't necessarily fatal. You can have a system where a statement can be both true and false, and the whole thing doesn't explode. This is a radical idea, but it's useful in certain areas, especially in philosophy, computer science, and linguistics, where messy or incomplete information is common. In these systems, Russell's paradox might still exist, but it's no longer a disaster. It's just something to manage. Others turn to a totally different kind of foundation, category theory. This approach doesn't rely on sets at all. Instead, it focuses on the relationships between things. A category is a collection of objects and arrows between them, like a network. In this view, the focus isn't on what something is, but how it connects to other things. Category theory has become very popular in parts of modern mathematics, and even in theoretical computer science. Some people see it as a better foundation, because it avoids many of the messy details that set theory has to deal with. And since it doesn't build everything on sets, Russell's paradox doesn't really appear. There's also type theory, which evolved out of Russell's original idea, but in a more modern form. In programming languages and formal logic systems, types help make sure that everything matches up correctly. You can't add a number to a sentence. You can't ask if a color is greater than a sound. Type systems catch these errors before they happen. In fact, many modern programming languages, like Haskell or Rust, use advanced type systems inspired by these logical foundations. And tools like Coq or Lean, which help people formally verify proofs, are built on type theory as well. They carry Russell's legacy in a new direction, one where paradoxes are prevented not by banning ideas, but by designing safer rules from the start. So where does that leave us? Well, the truth is, there is no single right answer to Russell's paradox. Instead, there are many different systems, each with its own strengths, trade-offs, and philosophical commitments. Some are simpler, some are more powerful, some are more elegant. But all of them are shaped by the same question Russell asked more than 100 years ago: how do we stop a system from breaking itself? The search for that answer didn't end with Russell, and it still continues today. Because at the end of the day, logic is more than a tool. It's a mirror. And every time we try to sharpen it, we see a little more of ourselves reflected in it. Our need for clarity, our fear of contradiction, and our endless drive to make sense of the world. Russell's paradox didn't just shake the foundations of logic and mathematics. It left a mark that would echo through the entire 20th century and beyond. Its legacy is bigger than a contradiction in set theory. It changed how we think about truth, how we build systems, and how we question the limits of human knowledge. One of the biggest ripple effects came in 1931, when Kurt Gödel published his incompleteness theorems. These theorems showed that in any logical system, powerful enough to include arithmetic, there will always be truths that cannot be proven within the system itself. That idea, that some truths are forever out of reach, was a direct response to the same crisis Russell had exposed. Gödel built on Russell's work, and even used the framework of Principia Mathematica to prove his point. But instead of fixing the problem, Gödel made it deeper. He showed that no matter how carefully we build a system, there will always be cracks, not just from paradoxes, but from truth itself slipping through the rules. This shifted the entire mood of philosophy and mathematics. Before Russell and Gödel, many thinkers believed we were on the verge of discovering a final, complete foundation for knowledge. After them, the tone changed. The dream of perfect certainty gave way to a more humble kind of understanding, one that accepts limits. But the paradox didn't just stay in logic. It made its way into other fields too. In the philosophy of language, Russell's discovery influenced thinkers like Ludwig Wittgenstein, who once studied with him. Wittgenstein came to believe that many philosophical problems come from how we use language. When we try to talk about everything, or when we mix different kinds of statements without realizing it, we can create confusion, just like in the paradox. This led to new ways of thinking about meaning, truth, and how language actually works. It also inspired Alfred Tarski's work on the concept of truth, where he introduced the idea of meta-languages, languages about languages, to prevent self-reference from causing paradoxes. That work became essential in modern logic and semantics. In computer science, Russell's paradox helped shape the foundations of programming. Many programming languages today use type systems, rules that make sure data and operations stay compatible. These ideas are direct descendants of the theory of types. They help prevent errors like circular references, infinite loops, and logical contradictions in code. When we design a language, a database, or even an AI model, we have to think carefully about how it handles self-reference, recursion, and definitions. Russell's paradox reminds us that letting something refer to itself too freely can lead to serious problems. Even in artificial intelligence, the same themes keep coming back. Can a machine understand itself? Can it evaluate its own processes or improve its own thinking? These are exciting ideas, but they're also risky, because the moment a system tries to describe itself completely, the shadow of the paradox returns. And in a broader philosophical sense, Russell's paradox speaks to something deeply human. We are the only creatures we know of that try to fully understand ourselves. We build models of the world, and then we ask whether those models include us. We ask if our thoughts can explain themselves, if our minds can fully grasp their own structure. Russell's discovery suggests that maybe they can't, or at least not all the way. But that's not a failure, that's the beauty of it. Russell's paradox reminds us that even in our most precise thinking, mystery still lives. That there's always a boundary between what we can describe and what lies just beyond. And that the search for truth, even when it leads to contradiction, is still one of the most meaningful things we can do. So yes, the paradox broke something, but it also opened something up. It made us rethink what logic is for. It made us more careful with language, more humble with knowledge, and more aware of the questions that don't have easy answers. And maybe, in the end, that is its true legacy. By now, we've seen how Russell's paradox shook the foundations of logic, changed mathematics, influenced philosophy, and even shaped modern computing. But beneath all the technical details, there's something even deeper happening. Russell's paradox isn't just about sets, it's about the limits of human thought. We often like to believe that with enough reason, with the right tools and enough effort, we can understand everything. We can build systems that explain the world, predict its behavior, and even explain ourselves. But the paradox reminds us, sometimes our own thinking loops back on itself. Sometimes, in trying to explain everything, we create contradictions we can't untangle. It's as if our minds are mirrors trying to reflect themselves, and the image starts to bend. This isn't just a problem of logic. It's a philosophical moment. A moment where we realize that even our best tools, logic, language, proof, have edges. And when we push too far, we don't just hit confusion. We hit something true about the nature of knowledge. It has boundaries. In a way, the paradox shows us the danger of total systems. Any system that tries to explain everything, without exception, without humility, risks breaking itself. We see this in logic, but also in ideologies, in political systems, and in personal belief. The moment you try to account for everything, including yourself, the contradictions creep in. Russell's paradox tells us to be cautious of that kind of thinking. But it's not a message of despair. In fact, it's kind of freeing. Because once we accept that our understanding has limits, we can stop chasing perfection and start asking better questions. We can build systems that are useful, knowing they'll never be complete. We can use logic wisely without pretending it holds all the answers. And we can treat uncertainty not as failure, but as a natural part of being human. The paradox is a mirror, yes, but it's also a window. It shows us that truth isn't always neat, that clarity sometimes brings complexity, and that there's beauty in the fact that reason itself has a boundary line. Russell's paradox teaches us something most paradoxes do, that sometimes the more we understand, the more we realize we don't. And maybe that's the beginning, not the end, of wisdom. Russell's paradox began as a crack in logic, but it revealed something much deeper. It showed us that even the cleanest, most precise systems can fold in on themselves, that even the sharpest minds can build structures that quietly carry their own undoing. But instead of seeing that as failure, maybe we can see it as something else, something beautiful. Because what Russell uncovered wasn't just a flaw, it was a truth about the limits of knowledge, a truth about the risks of total certainty, and a truth about what it means to think with care, humility, and curiosity. In chasing a perfect system, Russell found a paradox, but in facing that paradox, he helped create something even more important, a deeper understanding of logic, of language, and of ourselves. The mirror may be cracked, but through it, we see more clearly. And maybe that's what philosophy is all about, not giving us final answers, but teaching us how to live with the questions.